Good morning, this is Environmental Intelligence Episode 3 for March 2nd, 2026. Your daily briefing on environmental regulatory, science, and compliance developments that matter for Canadian professionals. Road salt accumulation in Ontario's Lake Simcoe watershed exceeds CCME chloride guidelines, triggering site assessments under OREG 153-04. Ontario watersheds face year-round chloride contamination from winter road salt, with Lake Simcoe levels surpassing CCME aquatic life thresholds of 120 mg/L chronic and 640 mg/L acute, requiring consultants to integrate salt transport modeling into Phase I ESAs and stormwater plans under the Environmental Protection Act. This directly impacts remediation projects in southern Ontario by necessitating chloride-specific risk assessments per Protocol 15. Professionals should monitor upcoming Ontario Ministry of the Environment consultations on salt management guidelines this quarter for compliance updates. Let's dive into the lead story because this one has real teeth for anyone handling contaminated sites in Ontario. Winter road salt applications are causing persistent chloride contamination in Ontario's Lake Simcoe watershed, affecting drinking water sources under the Ontario Environmental Protection Act and OREG 153-04 for contaminated sites. Previously, seasonal monitoring focused on acute winter spikes, but new data shows year-round exceedances of CCME water quality guidelines, with chronic exposures above 120 mg/L in groundwater and surface water. This shifts from episodic to continuous risk, complicating natural attenuation strategies. For practitioners, this means updating current site conceptual models in southern Ontario to include chloride as a contaminant of concern, potentially requiring permeable reactive barriers or enhanced pump and treat systems in remediation designs. What this signals is a broader push toward integrating non-traditional contaminants like chlorides into standard protocols, especially where watersheds feed into drinking water supplies. In practice, if you're scoping a Phase II ESA, you'll need to layer in salt transport modeling early to avoid rework during risk assessment. Watch for Ontario's proposed amendments to salt application standards under the Lakes and Rivers Improvement Act, with consultations expected by Q2 2026. Implementation could mandate revised Tier 1 risk screening levels by 2027, so factor that into your project timelines now. Delays in approvals could add months if you're not ahead of it. This isn't just a local issue. It underscores how everyday infrastructure maintenance can cascade into major remediation liabilities under the EPA. I've seen similar patterns in other provinces, but Ontario's data here is robust enough to force action. What I find interesting is how this might influence federal CCME updates, potentially harmonizing chloride thresholds across jurisdictions. If you're bidding on southern Ontario work, build in contingencies for these evolving standards. It's the difference between a smooth project and regulatory headaches. Moving to regulatory and policy watch, where cross-border developments could ripple into Canadian frameworks. Texas regulators are considering Dow's proposal to permit plastic pellet discharges into San Antonio Bay under state water quality rules, following a lawsuit for unauthorized pollution. This could set precedents for microplastics thresholds absent in current U.S. EPA guidelines. For Canadian professionals, this highlights potential harmonization risks under CPA 2024 amendments, where similar industrial discharges might influence federal toxic substance listings for plastics in interprovincial waters. Action required: review client effluent permits in BC and Alberta for microplastics monitoring ahead of possible CCME guideline updates by 2027. This ties into what we've seen in federal pushes under CPA, where microplastics are climbing the priority list for toxic substances. In BC, under the EMA, effluent permits already touch on this, but Alberta's EPA might see tighter alignment if CCME moves. The so what here is straightforward. If your clients operate near transboundary waters, this Texas case could prompt Ottawa to accelerate listings, affecting compliance monitoring in Phase I assessments. It's worth watching because it exposes gaps in our own guidelines. CCME has been slow on microplastics, but pressure from U.S. precedents might change that. Keep an eye on interprovincial implications, especially for sites along the Great Lakes or Pacific Coast. No need to panic, but incorporating microplastics into your next permit review could save headaches down the line. Now, shifting to science and technical updates, where new research intersects with our day-to-day risk modeling. Research quantifies that rising temperatures from climate change reduce EV battery lifespan by up to 20% in high heat scenarios, but advancements like solid-state electrolytes improve durability by 15–25%, maintaining capacity above 80% after 1,000 cycles under projected 2 4°C warming. This affects risk assessments in contaminated sites near transportation corridors, where EV infrastructure planning must incorporate BC CSR Protocol 13 climate adaptation factors or Alberta EPA flood risk mapping. Reference CCME soil quality guidelines for lithium and cobalt to adjust remediation endpoints in battery-related brownfields. Practically, if you're designing remediation for sites tied to EV charging hubs or battery recycling facilities, this data means tweaking your contaminant transport models to account for longer-term leaching under warmer conditions. It's confirming what many of us suspected: climate factors aren't abstract. They directly hit battery contaminants like lithium, potentially elevating soil and groundwater risks. In BC, Protocol 13 already mandates this for vapor and groundwater pathways, so integrate it into your next CSR submission. For Alberta, EPA's flood mapping ties in neatly, especially for oil sands areas pivoting to green tech. This is useful intelligence for brownfield redevelopments. It could shift your endpoints by 10–15% if you're modeling cobalt migration. No surprises here, but the quantification gives us better inputs for risk software. Plug in those 20% lifespan reductions to refine your scenarios. On to industry and practice, where today's quiet, nothing major shaking up the consulting or lab space directly. That said, the chloride story from Ontario reinforces the need for adaptive remediation tech in watershed projects, like scaling up permeable reactive barriers for in situ treatment. If you're in the lab side, expect more demand for chloride-specific assays aligned with CCME thresholds, especially in southern Ontario. Cost-wise, this could add 5–10% to Phase II budgets if salt modeling becomes standard, so factor that into proposals. For pipeline decommissioning or transportation corridor work, the EV battery insights mean cross-checking against CCME soil guidelines for emerging metals. Overall, it's a reminder to stay agile. These technical shifts affect everything from site assessments to compliance audits. Let's get to action items. These are your takeaways to apply today. If you're working on Ontario projects, review Phase I and II ESAs to incorporate chloride sampling per CCME guidelines, updating risk assessments under OREG 15304. Assess industrial client permits in BC and Alberta for microplastics compliance, cross-referencing CPAY schedules against Texas precedents. Integrate EV battery durability data into climate adaptation plans for sites under IAA, focusing on lithium contaminant transport modeling. Brief remediation teams on potential CCME updates for road salt, prioritizing in situ treatment tech like reactive barriers for watershed projects. Monitor Ontario EPA consultations on salt management to flag changes for Q2 2026 compliance reporting. These are crisp steps. Knock them out this week to stay ahead. Looking at the week ahead, mark your calendars for a few key dates. March 15th, 2026. Federal CPA toxic substances list review comments due for PFAS additions impacting national contaminated sites under CCME protocols. March 20th, 2026. Alberta EPA annual compliance reporting deadline for oil sands operators, requiring updated groundwater monitoring data per Tier 1 guidelines. March 25th, 2026, BC CSR Protocol 1 consultation closes on vapor intrusion updates, affecting remediation designs in urban brownfields. March 31st, 2026, Ontario OREG 15304 filing deadline for record of site condition submissions with emphasis on emerging contaminants like chlorides. Before we wrap, tomorrow, watch for updates on BC's vapor intrusion consultations as the deadline approaches, with potential shifts in urban remediation standards. That's environmental intelligence for March 2nd, 2026. If this briefing is useful to your practice, share it with a colleague and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're back tomorrow. Have a productive day.